Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome, everyone. Today we're diving deep into a pretty heavy part of American history, the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. We're going to be using a really fascinating podcast episode as our main source, and we're really hoping to kind of go beyond just the basic facts and really grapple with the long-term consequences of this event.
Yeah, it definitely brings up a lot of questions, like how fear and prejudice can, really undermine the core values of a nation.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the best place to start is with Executive Order 9066. It's hard to grasp how fast it all happened. Like weeks after Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt signs this order and boom, over 120,000 people are forced from their homes. And, many of them were U.S. citizens.
What's really striking is how the order basically made an entire ethnicity into criminals. Like it didn't matter if you were loyal to America, like a decorated veteran even, or like a child born here.
Yeah.
If you had Japanese ancestry, you were considered a potential threat.
The episode really paints a picture of all the chaos, the fear, families selling their stuff for nothing. It's just heartbreaking, the sheer injustice of it all.
And then there were the conditions in the camps. A lot of times they're in these desolate, remote areas, families crammed into these hastily built barracks, no privacy, food was scarce, medical care was bad.
It's mind-boggling that this happened in the land of the free, right?
Yeah.
The place that prides itself on liberty and justice for all. The podcast also goes into the economic devastation. Can you imagine having to leave your farm, your shop, everything you've built, and, with no hope of getting fair compensation?
Yeah, the economic impact was just devastating. A lot of Japanese Americans had built these successful businesses and farms, and then poof, it's all gone. It was like this systematic dispossession fueled by fear and racism, and the consequences lasted for generations.
And the worst part is that when the war ended and the camps closed, it still wasn't over for them. The podcast talks about how many families went back and found that their homes were gone, communities broken apart, and even faced hostility from their neighbors.
Imagine the feeling, betrayed by the country you called home. It took decades for the U.S. government to just admit that internment was wrong. The Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, they formed in the 80s. They finally concluded that internment wasn't about military necessity. It was driven by racial prejudice, wartime hysteria, and the failure of political leaders.
That's a really important point. It wasn't about security, it was about fear and prejudice. And even then, for a lot of Japanese Americans, just admitting it wasn't enough. They wanted justice, real compensation for what had been done to them.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
There was the 1948 Japanese American Claims Act.
Right.
And it did offer some compensation, but it was, just a tiny fraction of what they'd actually lost. A lot of people felt like it was an empty gesture that didn't even come close to addressing the scale of the injustice. And that's when you see the redress movement starting to emerge. They wanted a real apology and substantial reparations.
It's fascinating to see how that movement was inspired by the whole civil rights movement, like a new generation of Japanese Americans energized by that fight for equality happening all around them. They refused to let the injustice of internment just fade away. They knew the power of collective action, and they were determined to fight for their rights.
Yeah, it's amazing to see how that movement for redress gained so much momentum in the 70s and 80s. It wasn't just about the money, though. It was about getting their dignity back, their history, their place in America.
It's really interesting when you look at all the different perspectives on Japanese American internment. It shows how complex the whole thing is. The podcast episode talks about 4 different schools of thought, each with their own way of looking at it. It's like putting a puzzle together, right?
Exactly. There's the revisionist school. They emphasize the history of anti-Japanese feelings on the West Coast, way before the war. They point to all these laws discriminating against Japanese immigrants, like the ones that didn't let them own land.
So it wasn't just a reaction to Pearl Harbor. There was already this prejudice simmering under the surface that made it easy to make Japanese Americans into scapegoats when everyone was scared.
Right. And then there's the National Security School. They say that, yeah, it was an injustice, but the government was really scared after the attack. They point to all the panic and the belief that Japanese Americans might help the enemy.
But even then, you got to wonder, how could they just ignore the reports that said that wasn't true? The podcast mentions that even J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI director, he said the threat from Japanese Americans wasn't a big deal.
Right. And that's where the economic determinism school comes in. They think that economic rivalry was a big factor. See, a lot of Japanese Americans were successful farmers and business owners, especially in California. And some white Americans saw their success as a threat.
So internment wasn't just about racism. It was a chance to get rid of economic competition. The podcast has this chilling example about the fishing industry. Japanese Americans were really dominant in fishing, but when they were interned, their boats and equipment were sold off for cheap, often to their white competitors. Their whole livelihood gone just like that.
Yeah, it makes you think. Prejudice and self-interest often go together. Then, of course, there's the Civil Libertarian School. They focus on the violation of constitutional rights. To them, internment was just ignoring due process and equal protection under the law.
It's hard to understand how that could happen in a country that's supposed to be all about freedom and the rule of law. One of the most powerful parts of the podcast is when they talk about how internment affected the Japanese American community even years later. They talk about this historian, Michi Waiglin. She was one of the first to really study the psychological trauma of it all.
Wegland's work was really important. She found all this widespread depression, anxiety, even physical problems in the people who survived the camps long after they left. Imagine being ripped from your home, called the enemy, having all your rights taken away. That leaves a scar.
And it wasn't just the people who lived through it. The podcast mentions the Children of the Camps Project. They look at how trauma gets passed down through generations, how it affected the children and even grandchildren of those who were interned.
A lot of the children of those who were interned grew up with a sense of shame, like they were different or didn't belong. They struggled with their identity, trying to figure out how to be American when their family went through this.
It's just heartbreaking. And on top of all that trauma, many survivors didn't talk about what happened to them for years and years. The podcast calls it a culture of silence, this reluctance to even mention the pain and humiliation of internment.
And that silence says a lot. It shows how deep the shame went, the fear of bringing back those painful memories, and even the desire to protect younger generations from the burden of the past.
But as we know now, staying silent doesn't heal wounds. It often makes them worse. The Civil Liberties Act of 1988, it offered a formal apology and reparations, but you can't really put a price on psychological and cultural damage, right?
Exactly. That $20,000 they offered to each surviving internee was a gesture, but it couldn't erase the pain, the loss, all those years of struggle and discrimination. And for a lot of people, it came too late. They had already died, never got that recognition while they were alive.
This deep dive has really gotten me thinking. The legacy of Japanese American internment goes way beyond just what happened back then. It says something about prejudice, power, and how fragile civil liberties can be, issues we're still dealing with today.
Yeah, you're right. We see it in today's debates about immigration, national security, and how we treat minority groups. It reminds us that those feelings of fear and prejudice are still around, and we have to be careful to protect the rights of everyone.
But it's also amazing to see how resilient the Japanese American community was despite all that hardship. They rebuilt their lives, fought for their rights, and in the end, contributed so much to American society.
Their story is a testament to what humans can overcome. It's a story of perseverance, courage, and a belief in justice and equality.
It's incredible, right, how they were able to put their lives back together after something so traumatic. They faced so many obstacles, but they didn't give up.
It really shows you how strong people can be. Even when things are really bad, hope and resilience, they can win out in the end. And it's inspiring how they not only rebuilt their own lives, but also fought so hard to make sure that same injustice wouldn't happen again.
Like we've been talking about, the legacy of Japanese American internment. It goes way beyond the history books. It makes us face some uncomfortable truths about ourselves, about how easily fear and prejudice can take root, even in a country that's all about freedom and justice.
Absolutely. This deep dive, it isn't just about looking back. It's about understanding how the past shapes the present and how we can learn from those mistakes so we can create a better future, a fairer future.
And what gets me is how relevant it all feels today. We see this same kind of thing happening now, how certain groups get targeted and blamed when there's a crisis or when people are uncertain, like Muslims after 9/11 or immigrants at the border, or the rise in anti-Asian hate during the pandemic. It seems like we haven't really learned from the past.
It's a reminder that those feelings of prejudice and discrimination, they're still out there. And it's so easy for them to grow when people are afraid.
So what can we do? How do we stop this from happening over and over again?
Well, I think it starts with education. We need to teach future generations about what happened with Japanese American internment. Not just as a one-time thing, but as part of a bigger problem of discrimination in our country's history.
And it's not just about memorizing facts and dates, right? It's about teaching kids how to think critically, how to feel empathy. and encouraging them to question what they're told and to stand up against injustice whenever they see it. It's about understanding how easily people can be tricked by propaganda and fear-mongering that leads to violating people's rights.
Yeah, exactly. We need to give young people the tools to recognize and dismantle the systems of prejudice and discrimination that are still around today, to empower them to be part of the fight for a more just and equal world.
And it's not just on teachers. Parents, community leaders, policymakers, we all have to play a part in shaping attitudes and making sure everyone feels included. It's about creating a culture where diversity is celebrated and people are treated with respect no matter their differences, a place where everyone feels like they belong.
That's right. It's about creating a society where people are judged by who they are on the inside, not by their ethnicity or their background.
I think as we wrap up this deep dive, the big takeaway is this. We can never take our freedoms for granted. We have to remember that civil liberties are fragile and they can be taken away, especially during tough times. And we always have to defend the rights of every single person, no matter their race, religion, or anything else that might make them a target of prejudice.
I agree. And even when things are really dark, there's always hope. The story of Japanese-American internment, it's a sad story, but it's also a story about resilience and courage. It shows that people never stopped believing in justice and equality.
It reminds us that we all have a responsibility to speak up when we see injustice happening, to fight against prejudice, and to work towards a world where something like this never happens again. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this has made you want to keep learning and questioning and engaging with all the difficult parts of our past and our present.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.